He asked me on a Saturday morning in October. My birthday. 34 years old. The morning had started the way birthdays do when you are married to someone who remembers the details. Coffee already made when I came downstairs, the specific mug I preferred. The kind of quiet domestic care that had always been one of the things I loved most about Stellan. I sat at the kitchen table. I wrapped both hands around the mug. I looked at the garden through the glass door and felt the particular warmth of a morning that belonged entirely to me. Then Stellan sat down across from me. He did not say happy birthday first. That was the first signal, small, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you only understand in retrospect. He sat down with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided that today is the day to put it down regardless of what today is. He said he needed to talk to me about something important. I looked at him. He said our marriage was not working. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he had thought about this for months and he believed the kindest thing, the most honest thing, was to end it before any more time was spent on something that could not be repaired. He said he wanted a divorce. My name is Amara. I was 34 years old on the morning my husband asked me for a divorce. And what I did in the next 30 seconds changed everything that followed. I want to tell you what the marriage had been before I tell you what happened to it. Stellan and I met when I was 27. He was 30. We were at a friend's birthday dinner, a long table, 12 people, the kind of evening that starts formal and ends with everyone talking to the person across from them as though they have always known each other. He was across from me. We talked for 4 hours. When the restaurant closed, we stood on the pavement outside and talked for another hour in the cold until we both admitted we were freezing and exchanged numbers and went home. He called the following morning. We were together within a month and married within 3 years. The wedding was small and exactly right, the people who mattered, a venue that felt like us, vows we had written ourselves that said the true things rather than the conventional ones. The marriage was good. I want to be honest about that because it matters for what comes later. It was not a marriage that had always been broken. It was a marriage that had been genuinely good, warm and honest, and built on the specific foundation of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and who had continued choosing each other through the ordinary years. And then something had shifted. Slowly, the way the important shifts always happen. Not in one moment, but in the accumulation of moments. The distance that had grown. The conversations that had become shorter. The particular quality of two people living in parallel rather than together. I had noticed it. I had not named it. I should have named it. The 30 seconds after he asked for a divorce are the ones I have thought about most in the time since. Because something happened in those 30 seconds that I had not planned and had not known I was capable of. Something that arrived not from a strategy or a decision, but from a place much deeper than either. From the place where your truest self lives, the one that does not perform or manage or adjust to the room. The one that simply knows. I put down my coffee mug. I stood up. I walked to the drawer in the kitchen where we kept important documents, the kind of drawer that every household has, full of things that need to exist somewhere specific. I opened it. I found the folder I was looking for. Inside it were documents I had not looked at since the day they had been given to us, legal paperwork from the solicitor who had handled our house purchase, along with a copy of our marriage certificate and several other documents. And at the back of the folder, in an envelope I had not opened since it arrived, were the divorce papers. I had not known they were there. I understood in that moment that Stellan had placed them there. That he had prepared for this conversation. That the coffee had been made and the mug had been chosen and the morning had been given to me precisely because he had been managing his own guilt about what was coming. I took the papers out of the envelope. I found a pen in the drawer. I signed my name on the line before he had finished the sentence he had started when he saw what I was doing. I placed the papers on the table between us. I picked up my coffee. I said, "Happy birthday" to me. Then I walked upstairs. I want to tell you what I was feeling in those 30 seconds and in the minutes after because I think the truth of it is more complicated than the action suggests. I was not calm. Not in the way the action made me look. Inside there was something enormous, moving grief and shock, and the specific devastation of a woman who had drunk coffee from her favorite mug on her birthday and been handed the end of her marriage in the same breath. But underneath that, deeper than that, something else was moving too. Clarity. The same clarity I had felt when I understood, somewhere in the months before that morning, that the distance between us had become something neither of us had been addressing. That we had been performing a marriage rather than living one. That the coffee and the mug and the careful domestic gestures were the last remaining language of something that had stopped being spoken a long time ago. He had not surprised me with the content. He had surprised me with the timing. And the timing had done something to me. It had removed every last reason to pretend. Every last motivation to negotiate or soften or manage the situation. He had chosen my birthday, the most personal day, and in doing so had made the decision so complete and so final that the only authentic response was an equally complete and final one. I had signed the papers before he finished his sentence because there was nothing left to finish. I called my sister Yemi from the bedroom. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything in the precise, ordered way I communicated things when I was managing something significant and could not afford to fall apart yet. She was quiet throughout. Yemi had always been quiet when things were serious. She saved her loudness for the moments when loudness was what was needed and understood that this was not one of those moments. When I finished, she said, "Where is he now?" I said, "Downstairs. Probably still at the kitchen table." She said, "And you?" I said, "Bedroom. Sitting on the floor, actually." She said, "Okay. Do you want me to come?" I said, "Not yet. I need to think first." She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking that I signed those papers without hesitation, and I need to understand whether that was the truest thing I have ever done or the most reactive." Yemi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those are not mutually exclusive." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She was right. The truest things and the most reactive things often live very close together. The question was not whether the action had been right. The question was what I was going to do now that it was done. I sat on the bedroom floor for 40 minutes. Then I stood up. I washed my face. I went downstairs. Stellan was still at the kitchen table. The papers were where I had placed them. I said, "I am going to need you to give me some space today." He said, "Amara." I said, "Today. Please." He left an hour later. The weeks after the signing were the most clarifying of my adult life. I say clarifying rather than difficult because difficult implies that the primary experience was pain and the primary experience was not pain. Pain was present consistently, in the specific way it is present when something large has ended and your daily life still has the shape of it everywhere you look. The coffee mug. The side of the wardrobe. The specific silence of a house that had been built for two people and was now occupied by one. But underneath the pain something else was happening that I had not anticipated. I was meeting myself. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movies where a woman goes on a journey and finds herself at the top of a mountain. In the ordinary, daily, unglamorous way of a person who has been one half of a unit for 7 years and is suddenly required to be a whole. I made decisions alone. I managed the house alone. I ate what I wanted to eat and went where I wanted to go and spent Saturday mornings exactly as I chose without the negotiation that marriage requires and that I had not realized I had been conducting every weekend for 7 years. I called Petra, a friend I had let drift in the marriage years, the way friendships sometimes drift when a partnership becomes the center of gravity. And we met for dinner and talked for 3 hours, and she said I seemed different, and I asked how, and she said lighter, and I understood what she meant. I was lighter. The loss was real. And I was lighter. Stellan called for the first time 11 days after he left. I did not answer. He called again the following day. And the day after. I let all of them go to voicemail. Not because I was punishing him, I want to be clear about that. I was not interested in punishment. I was simply not ready. I was in the middle of something important, the meeting of myself, and I understood that answering his calls before I had finished that process would interrupt it in ways I could not yet afford. He left voicemails. I listened to each one once. The first 3 were practical logistics about the house, about shared accounts, about the administrative dismantling of a life built together. His voice in these was careful and professional, the voice of someone managing a process. The 4th voicemail was different. He said, "I made a mistake." 4 words. Left on a Tuesday evening at 7:43. I know the exact time because I checked after I listened to it, standing in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, trying to locate the feeling those words produced. It was not the feeling I would have predicted. It was not relief or vindication or the particular warmth of being wanted back. It was something more complicated. The feeling of a sentence that has arrived too late and too early simultaneously. Too late for the version of me who had needed it before the birthday morning. Too early for the version of me who was still in the middle of becoming someone who did not need it at all. I saved the voicemail. I did not call back. He came to the house on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after he had left. I saw his car from the upstairs window before he knocked. I watched him sit in the car for 7 minutes before he got out. I watched him walk to the door with the specific posture of someone who has rehearsed a conversation so many times it has stopped feeling rehearsed and started feeling inevitable. He knocked. I went downstairs. I opened the door. He looked different from 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically, he was not disheveled or broken in the visible way that people sometimes expect. But something in his face had changed. The particular quality of certainty that had always been one of his most consistent characteristics, the quiet confidence that I had loved and that had sometimes, in the difficult years, felt more like distance than confidence, was not entirely present. He said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Yes." But not inside. We sat on the front steps. The street was quiet. The evening light was the specific gold of autumn. He talked for a long time. I listened in the full way I had always listened, completely, without preparing my response while he was still speaking. He said he had been wrong. Not about the marriage being in difficulty. He had been right about that. He had been wrong about the solution. He had diagnosed the problem correctly and prescribed the wrong treatment. He said the distance between us had been real. And he had decided that ending the marriage was the honest response to that distance rather than the work that might have closed it. He said, I chose the easier thing and called it honesty. I sat with what he had said for a long time before I responded. The evening had gone darker while he was talking. The gold light had faded to the blue-gray of early night. Our breath was visible in the cold. I said, Stellan, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly. He said, anything. I said, when did you stop trying? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, about a year ago. I said, and you did not tell me. He said, no. I said, why? He said, because I did not know how to tell you I had given up without it sounding like giving up. So I managed the distance instead. I was kind and present and I made the coffee and remembered the mug and I told myself that was enough. I said, it was not enough. He said, I know. I know that now. I looked at the street. A car passed. Someone walked a dog. The ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way around two people sitting on front steps in the cold. I said, I need you to hear something. He said, I am listening. I said, I signed those papers without hesitating. And in the weeks since I have been becoming someone who does not need you to come back. I want you to understand that. I am not the person you left on my birthday. She has been changing. He said, I know. I can see it. I said, so whatever this is, whatever you are asking for, it cannot be about restoring what we had. Because what we had was already broken before you sat down at that table. He said, I know. I am not asking for that. I said, what are you asking for? He said, the chance to build something better than what we had. If you are willing. I did not answer him that night. I said I needed time. He said he understood. He stood up from the front steps, and he looked at me in the specific way of someone who has said the true thing and is now required to wait for the response without trying to manage it. He said, "I will wait." I said, "I know you will. But waiting is not enough." He said, "What is enough?" I said, "I do not know yet. But I will tell you when I do." He went in his car. He drove away. I sat on the front steps alone for another 20 minutes in the cold. Yemi called while I was sitting there. I told her what had happened. She listened to everything. Then she said, "What do you want? Not what should you do? Not what is the right decision. What do you want?" I sat with the question. The honest answer was complicated. I wanted the version of Stellan who had sat across from me at a long dinner table when I was 27 and talked until the restaurant closed. I wanted the man who had called the following morning and who had written vows that said the true things. I wanted the marriage that had been genuinely good before the drift. What I did not want was to rebuild something on the same foundation that had cracked. I said to Yemi, "I want something new. With him. If he can build it." She said, "Then tell him that." I said, "Not yet. He needs to show me first." What Stellan did in the months that followed was not what I expected. I had expected the large gestures, the flowers, the letters, the dramatic declarations that people make when they are trying to win something back and are performing the effort rather than doing it. He did not do any of that. What he did was smaller and more consistent and considerably harder to dismiss. He called every evening at 7. Not to persuade me, not to make his case, simply to talk. About his day, about something he had read, about a memory that had surfaced and that he wanted to share. The calls were 15 minutes long on average. They ended cleanly, without pressure, without any implication that I owed him a different response than the one I was giving. He started therapy. He told me on the 3rd week. Not as evidence to present. He was careful about that, careful not to frame it as something he was doing for me. He said he was doing it because he needed to understand how he had managed the distance rather than addressing it, and he did not think he could understand that alone. He sent me a book in the 6th week. No note. Just a book he had mentioned once, 2 years into our marriage, that I had wanted to read and never bought. No message. No expectation. Just the book in a padded envelope with my name on it. I sat with the book for a day before I opened it. Then I called him. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." I said, "How is the therapy?" He said, "Difficult. Useful." I said, "Good." We talked for an hour that evening. It was the first conversation since the birthday morning that felt like two people talking rather than one person making a case and one person deciding. I started therapy in the 8th week. Not because Stellan had. Not in response to anything he had done. Because I had been honest enough with myself by then to understand that the marriage had not broken unilaterally. That the drift had been a two-person phenomenon. That there were things I had not said in the difficult years and ways I had managed the silence rather than addressing it that had contributed to the distance as much as his had. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Sable who had the specific quality of asking questions that arrived exactly where the answer was and then waiting in complete silence until the answer came. In the 3rd session, she asked me what I was most afraid of. I said, building it again and having it break the same way. She said, "What would have to be different for that not to happen?" I said, "Honesty. Earlier. Before the distance gets wide enough that neither of us knows how to cross it." She said, "And do you believe that is possible with him?" I sat with that for a long time. I said, "I am starting to." She said, "What has changed?" I said, "He is doing the work without asking me to watch him do it. That is different from everything I expected." She said, "Why does that matter?" I said, "Because people who do things to be seen doing them stop when the audience stops watching. He has not stopped. I am not watching, and he has not stopped." 3 months after the birthday morning, I asked Stellan to meet me. Not at the house. At the restaurant where we had our first date. The choice was deliberate. Not nostalgic. I was not interested in nostalgia. But precise. The place where we had first spoken honestly to each other for hours felt like the right place to speak honestly again. He was already there when I arrived. He had chosen the same table. I did not know if that was intentional, and I did not ask. He stood when I came in, and there was something in the way he stood that was different from every other time I had seen him stand in 7 years of marriage. He was not performing anything. He was simply there. We ordered. We talked about small things while the food arrived. Then I put down my fork and looked at him. I said, "I need to tell you some things." He said, "I am listening." I told him about the drift from my side, the conversations I had not started, the needs I had not named, the way I had managed the silence with warmth and routine, because naming what was missing felt like admitting a failure I did not know how to fix. I told him I had been performing the marriage in the difficult years the same way he had, that we had both been managing rather than addressing. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I know." I could see it from my side, and I could not name it either. I said, "We were both afraid." He said, "Yes." I said, "I do not want to be afraid of honest conversations anymore." He said, "Neither do I. I want to tell you what the 3 months had done to me. Because this story is not only about Stellan and what he did in those months. It is about what I did. What happened to me in the space that the birthday morning had created. I had met myself. I said that earlier, and I mean it fully. The woman who had signed those papers without hesitation, I had not known her well before that morning. She had been present but not central. She had existed in the edges of the marriage, accommodating and warm and skilled at managing the emotional weather of a shared life. In the 3 months, she had become the center. She had made every decision. She had managed every morning and every evening and every Saturday without negotiation. She had called Petra and gone to dinners and taken a long weekend alone to a place she had always wanted to visit and had never gone because the timing had never aligned with someone else's preferences. She had discovered that she was excellent company for herself. That is not a small thing. That is the thing that changes the quality of every relationship that follows. The knowledge that you do not need the other person to be complete. That you are choosing them rather than requiring them. I was choosing Stellan. Not because the divorce papers had frightened me, or because the house was lonely, or because the voicemail had weakened my resolve. I was choosing him because I had spent 3 months becoming someone who could choose from strength rather than from need. That was new. That was everything. We agreed to start again. Not where we had been. Not the resumption of the marriage that had drifted. Something new. With new agreements and new honesty and the specific commitment to say the true thing earlier, before the distance had time to grow. He moved back into the house on a Sunday in January. 3 months and 12 days after my birthday morning. I want to tell you about that Sunday because it was not what either of us had imagined in the easy version of this story. It was not romantic. It was not the movie version of reconciliation with music and rain and a declaration in a hallway. It was 2 people carrying boxes and making decisions about where things went and cooking dinner together for the first time in months in a kitchen that had been only mine and was now becoming ours again. It was ordinary and careful and slightly awkward in the way of 2 people who know each other well and are simultaneously learning each other again. At one point, we were both reaching for the same thing in the cupboard, and we stopped and looked at each other and started laughing at exactly the same moment. Not the performance of lightness. The real thing. Surprised out of us by the absurdity of ordinary life continuing to be ordinary in the middle of everything that had happened. I thought, this is what I was missing when we were managing rather than living. The laughter. The accidental, unglamorous, real laughter. I need to tell you about the evening 3 weeks after he moved back in. Because the story would be incomplete without it, and because I think it is the most important moment in everything that followed. We were having dinner. An ordinary Tuesday. Nothing significant had happened. The day had been unremarkable in the way most days are unremarkable when you are building something rather than performing it. I said something. I do not remember exactly what, something about a conversation at work that had bothered me, something I had been carrying quietly all day in the way I had learned to carry things quietly over the years. I said it in passing. Not as a declaration. Just a sentence in the middle of dinner. Stellan put down his fork. He said, "Tell me more about that." 4 words. Simple. Direct. The specific words of someone who has been paying attention and wants to keep paying attention. I looked at him. He looked back. And I told him. All of it. The whole conversation from work and why it had bothered me and what it connected to and what I needed from the evening to feel better. I said all of it without managing it or reducing it or worrying about whether the timing was right. He listened to every word. Then he said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "This. Exactly this." He said, "I know. I should have been asking it for years." I said, "Yes. But you're asking now." He picked up his fork. I picked up mine. We finished dinner. It was the most ordinary, extraordinary evening I had ever had. 6 months after the birthday morning, I withdrew the divorce papers. My solicitor, a precise, efficient woman named Mrs. Okafor who had seen everything in 30 years of family law and was not given to sentiment, looked at me across her desk when I told her what I wanted to do. She said, "Are you certain?" I said, "Yes." She said, "May I ask what changed?" I said, "I did." And then he did. In that order. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "That is the right order." She processed the withdrawal. It was administrative and quick and carried none of the weight that the signing had carried on a Saturday birthday morning. I walked out of her office into the November street and stood for a moment in the cold. I thought about the 30 seconds. The drawer. The pen. The papers placed on the table before he had finished his sentence. I had not known in those 30 seconds what I was beginning. I had thought I was ending something. I had been ending something, the version of the marriage that had been running on fumes, on managed distance, on careful domestic gestures that had replaced genuine presence. I had ended that. And in the space the ending created, something else had become possible. Not a return. A beginning. The distinction mattered enormously. Yemi came for dinner in the month after I withdrew the papers. She had been my closest witness to everything, the call from the bedroom floor, the front steps conversation, the 3 months, the January Sunday. She had asked the right questions at each stage and given me space to find the right answers and never once told me what she thought I should do. She sat at our kitchen table, Stellan's and mine, ours, and ate the food we had cooked together and talked to both of us with the easy warmth of someone who had been waiting for this particular evening for a long time. After dinner, Stellan went to make tea and Yemi looked at me across the table. She said, "You look different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "Complete. You look complete." I thought about what she meant. About the woman I had been before the birthday morning, present and warm and genuinely loving, but also, somewhere underneath all of it, slightly contracted, slightly reduced, living inside the marriage rather than alongside it. And the woman I was now, who had signed papers on a birthday morning and spent 3 months meeting herself and built something alone that she could now choose to share. Complete was the right word. I said, "I feel it." Stellan came back with the tea. He set a mug in front of me, the specific one, the preferred one, without thinking about it. The automatic care of someone who knows you well. This time I received it differently. Not as a gesture from a man managing his guilt. As the ordinary kindness of someone who simply knew me. The first birthday after everything was a Saturday in October again. 1 year exactly from the birthday morning. I had thought about it in the weeks approaching. Not with dread. With a kind of careful attention. The specific anniversary of the worst and best morning of my marriage deserved some form of acknowledgement, and I had not known what form until the week before when Stellan asked me what I wanted to do. I said, "I want to stay home. I want to cook something good. I want to have Yemi and Petra and maybe 2 others who matter, and I want to eat well and talk properly." He said, "Done." He organized everything. Not in the managed, guilty way of the previous year's coffee and mug. In the genuine, attentive way of someone who has learned the difference between performing care and offering it. The evening was exactly what I had asked for. 8 people around a table. Food that had taken most of the afternoon. Conversations that went to the places conversations go when everyone in the room actually knows each other. At some point during the evening, Stellan caught my eye from across the table. He raised his glass slightly. Just to me. Just a small, private acknowledgement. I raised mine back. Nobody else noticed. It was not for anyone else. It was for the birthday morning. For the 30 seconds. For the drawer and the pen and the papers. For the 3 months. For the Tuesday dinner and the 4 words and the January Sunday and the ordinary extraordinary evening with the forks. For everything it had taken to arrive at this table on this evening. I want to tell you what I learned about signing those papers. Because I think people hear the story and they hear the action, signing before he finished his sentence, and they read it as strength. As a power move. As the decisive act of a woman who refused to be destroyed by what was being done to her. And it was those things. But it was also something else. It was the most honest thing I had done in years. Because the marriage had needed to end. Not permanently, events proved that. But the version of the marriage that existed on that birthday morning needed to end completely and finally and without negotiation. It had been running on managed distance and careful gestures and the unspoken agreement of 2 people who were too afraid of what honest conversations might cost to have them. Signing the papers ended that marriage. And only when that marriage was fully ended, only when I had spent 3 months in the space the ending created, meeting myself and understanding what I needed and what I was capable of and what I would require from any version of what came next, could something new begin. The signing was not the end of my marriage. It was the surgery. Necessary. Painful. The removal of something that had stopped working so that what remained could heal and grow differently. I do not recommend it as a strategy. I recommend honesty earlier, the kind Stellan and I now practice with deliberate and sometimes uncomfortable consistency. But I am grateful for the birthday morning. For the 30 seconds. For the drawer and the pen. They gave me the truest thing I had. They gave me myself. Dr. Sable asked me in one of our later sessions what the birthday morning had changed most fundamentally. I thought about it for a long moment. I said, I stopped being afraid of my own needs. She said, say more. I said, I spent 7 years in a marriage being a version of myself that was very good at caring for someone else's needs and not very honest about my own. Not because Stellan suppressed them. Because I managed them. I translated them into things that were easier to express. I reduced them to fit the space that was comfortable. She said, and now? I said, now I say what I need when I need it. Before it becomes distance. Before it becomes something that has to be managed rather than addressed. She said, how does that feel? I said, exposed sometimes. Right, always. She nodded. She said, that is what honest relationships feel like. Exposed and right simultaneously. I said, I wish I had known that 7 years ago. She said, you know it now. I said, yes. And so does he. She said, that is what makes the difference. I want to tell you about the conversation Stellan and I had on the 1-year anniversary of the birthday morning. Not the party. The morning itself. Before Yemi and Petra arrived. Before the cooking and the table and the evening. We were in the kitchen. Coffee already made. The specific mug. He placed it in front of me and sat down across from me. He said, I need to say something. I looked at him. For a fraction of a second, I felt the ghost of the previous year. The same kitchen, the same table, the same opening. Then the ghost dissolved because the man across from me was not the man of the previous October. He had been changed by the months the same way I had. He said, I am sorry I chose your birthday. I have thought about that many times. The timing was not accidental. I chose it because I thought the day would make you less likely to react badly. I thought you would want to protect the day. He said, I was wrong about that. And I was wrong about a great deal else. But that specifically, using the day, I am sorry for. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, I know. I forgave that a long time ago. He said, I know. I needed to say it anyway. I said, I know. We drank our coffee. The morning was quiet and warm and entirely ours. People ask me sometimes, women specifically, women who have heard parts of the story through friends or colleagues or the specific way that other people's relationship stories travel, whether I regret signing the papers. I tell them no. Every single time. Without hesitation. Not because the marriage had not been worth saving. It had been. It was. The person I am married to now, the Stellan who does therapy and calls at 7 and asks, tell me more about that, and stood up from the front steps and said, I will wait, is worth every version of saving. But I could not have found him without the birthday morning. I could not have found myself without it either. The papers were the door. Not the exit. The door, the one that opened into the space where both of us had to become honest enough with ourselves to be honest with each other. He had come to that door by watching me walk through it first. And I had walked through it because there was no other direction left. Because the 30 seconds had happened before my mind could manage the response. Because the truest part of me had acted before the managing part could intervene. The truest part of me had known what was needed. She still does. The second birthday was a Sunday. 35 years old. Stellan made breakfast, properly, the kind that takes an hour and fills the kitchen with the specific smell of a morning that has been thought about. We ate at the kitchen table with the glass door open to the garden because the October morning was unexpectedly warm. He placed the coffee in front of me. The specific mug. The preferred one. I wrapped both hands around it. I looked at him. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, Happy birthday. 2 words. The 2 words he had not said first the previous year. Simple. Direct. The most ordinary thing. I said, Thank you. We sat in the warm October morning and drank our coffee, and the garden was the same garden it had always been, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, and the table was the same table. And we were entirely different people sitting inside all of it. Better people. More honest people. People who had been through the thing that had needed to happen and had come out the other side not unscathed, genuinely, in ways that had required work and time and the specific courage of 2 people who had decided the truth was worth the cost, but whole. Whole in a way that the previous version of the marriage had not produced. The birthday morning had cost us everything. And given us something worth more. I want to tell you what I would say to the woman sitting on a bedroom floor on a birthday morning. The one who had just signed divorce papers before her husband finished his sentence. Who was holding her phone waiting for her sister to answer. Who was trying to determine whether what she had done was the truest thing or the most reactive. I would say, both. Both is the answer. I would say, you are going to spend 3 months meeting yourself, and it is going to be the most important 3 months of your life. Do not rush it. Do not let anyone rush it. The loneliness is real, and the grief is real, and the particular ache of a house built for 2 people occupied by one is real. Let all of it be real. It is doing something important. I would say, he is going to call. And then he is going to come to the front steps. And what he says there is going to be true, but not enough. Let it be not enough. Not enough is the honest assessment of where things are, and you cannot build something new on a foundation of pretending things are further along than they are. I would say, the new thing, the thing worth building, is on the other side of both of you becoming honest. Not just him. You too. The drift was not unilateral and the repair cannot be either. And I would say, the coffee mug on a Sunday October morning 1 year from now. The garden through the glass door. The happy birthday said first this time. The whole ordinary extraordinary morning. It is coming. You just have to be willing to do the work that gets you there. My name is Amara. My husband asked for a divorce on my birthday. I signed the papers before he finished his sentence. He was outside my door every night for 3 months. I answered on a Thursday evening on the front steps. And the marriage that followed is nothing like the one I signed away. It is better. Entirely, honestly, completely better. That is what the birthday morning gave us. And I would not give it back for anything.